Good morning, friends and family of Don and Pat. You honour me by your presence. I thought I would start with some fairly general remarks about Bletchley Park. I know at least one member has actually been there, but has anybody else been to Bletchley Park? No, that's normal. Oh, yes. Yes. Better than average. The Bletchley Park is, I'll start with the pre-war part of this. What was conditioning everybody's lives in England at the time pre-war was whether one thought there was going to be a war or whether one thought there wasn't, and they were very divided, with the popular press in favour of no war and the government quietly planning things in case there were to be one. And one of the things that got done was to choose a wartime headquarters for the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, otherwise known as MI6, because the thing that everybody expected was, and largely due to writers like H.G. Wells, they expected the war to start with a terrific aerial bombardment which would lay waste to the whole country. That was what everybody expected. Well, as part of these anti-air raid precautions, a site about 50 miles north of London was chosen on a railway line, a main line, and with other advantages and disadvantages. And when the war broke out, just before the war broke out, it was about 120 people belonging to what was known in those days as the Government Code and Cipher School, which was really the code-breaking place, moved out there and remained there until the end of the war. It had been intended to be also the wartime site for the Secret Intelligence Service itself, that's the agent-running organisation. Although they did send some people there for a time, most of them, even those, moved back to London when it was evident that there was a limit, though it was pretty dreadful, to what damage air raids could cause. Various other things were going on in connection with the production of intelligence from foreign communications. There was an air section in there were service sections in GCNCS who were producing fairly useful intelligence about such things as the war in Abyssinia, the activities of the Russians and Italians in Spain before the war, and also some work on the German Air Force. They denied having one until a very short time before the war, but had in fact created a force, a bomber attacking force and the other parts of an air force, and were exercising their long-range aircraft over the North Sea and out into the Atlantic occasionally. In secret, they denied this was going on, but it was detected by the arrangements to intercept their communications, which the Air Ministry planned to have a station which would hear what they expected to be shortwave communications on shortwave by any long-range aircraft doing reconnaissance or actually attacking England once the war had started. And they were indeed successful. Before the war, in producing information, before the war, these communications between long-range bombers and ground stations were clear. There were no codes involved. And of course that enabled the station, which had been interception station, a radio wireless station, enabled it to learn what sort of communications the Germans were going to employ, which we expected they would put into code in one way or another, which of course they did. But it meant that right from, 2 years before the war, this station at a place called Cheadle in Staffordshire was providing the Air Ministry with numbers of bombers possessed by the the Germans, and where they were based, and to a certain extent what their capabilities were, in other words, their flying speeds and that sort of business. This was done by just listening to their communications and using direction finding stations to see to hear where they were. And this information was probably included among the intelligence that was supplied off the record to Churchill before the war, and which got him interested in this question of the German preparations for a war, made him convinced that the Germans were going to start a war. I don't know that this, for a fact that this stuff was included in what the intelligence that reached Churchill, but it certainly, I know it was almost all the wars about the Air Force at the time, so it probably was included in this stuff which was passed to him by someone who exceeded his duties and in fact committed suicide when the war broke out. The Bletchley itself was a Bletchley Park, was been created in Victorian times, in fact built in Victorian times, with a large decorative garden. The building itself was a monstrosity of the typical American turrets and ridges and everything else you could think of screwed on. But it was a very suitable place, suitable distance, and it had got a lot of outbuildings, stables, and that sort of thing appropriate to a big country house. The move to Bletchley was only a week or so before the war, and about 120 people moved from ECTS. Had about 120 people in those days. A few of them, say a dozen perhaps, were people who'd learnt the trade of producing information from ciphers and intercepted communications in World War I. And they were, of course, getting on a bit, and only one of them, in fact, survived throughout the war. The others retired, or some of them indeed died of age during the war. The one who did survive, in fact, was the deputy head of the outfit, and you may know him. He was the man who broke the Zimmermann telegram during World War I, a very important bit of intelligence which, in fact, led to the United States joining the war. They were persuaded by the contents of this telegram that the Germans were ill-intentioned towards them. The communications that were being used before the war were, as I mean, were in plain language, and they were mostly the communications involved just in preparing for aircraft to take off. That meant tuning the radio sets in the aircraft and the radio sets on the ground that were being in touch with them, making sure they would be able to hear each other when the aircraft was in flight. And that was an important indication, this tuning process, before the airplanes had even taken off. And of course, eventually, after the war broke out, that was an important warning, an indication that there were going to be operations. This didn't involve ciphers, it was just the aircraft and the ground stations ensuring they would be able to communicate with each other successfully. And the landing process involved aircraft getting in touch with an airfield, obviously, saying who they were, which meant they had to give their identity away in some form or another. And that information, it was that information which was available throughout the war without any codes at all needing to be broken. It was just a weakness in the German arrangements. Although it was overtaken later on as a source of order of battle, in other words, the total layout of the German Air Force, it was important. It survived and was important right till the end of the war. Part of this set up was the operation of radio beacons. In those days there weren't any complicated navigation systems for aircraft, and they depended on knowing roughly where they were, and that was all it was, by tuning in to radio beacons in certain fixed spots in Germany, and taking bearings on them and working out their own position from that. Very crude, but it was a way of navigating approximately. In the end, I'll just leap ahead a bit for a moment, the RAF, when it began bombing raids, wasn't right at the beginning of the war. They were dropping pamphlets to begin with, exhorting the Germans to lay down their arms. It didn't get very far. So I lost my trip. Yes, a moment. The point I was wanting to make was that the RAF, the Royal Air Force, needed some sort of navigational device and hadn't got any. And they used these German ones. They listened in to the German beacons. The station at Cheadle, the origin of all this, source of all this stuff, worked out where all the beacons were, identified them. They used call signs to indicate who they were. Cheadle worked out what their names were, what their call signs were, which enabled Bomber Command for about 2 years to navigate over Germany and Western Europe using German resources. The Germans discovered this, realized it was going on, and whereas to begin with they were changing the call signs and frequencies of these beacons once a day, they changed them up to 12 times a day. But Cheadle managed to keep abreast of that and was supplying valuable information to Bomber Command and others for the first 2 years of the war. They later on had navigation systems of their own. Come back to Bletchley Park itself. Bletchley Park main function in the very early days, active function I would say, because it was operating as a headquarters and all that, but in terms of producing intelligence that people wanted, it was its main task was to support Cheadle. Now, ensure that if complicated call sign systems, changing call sign systems were used and anything else they needed to help with, it was our job at Bletchley Park, the air section at Bletchley Park, to support Cheadle. So the air section was playing a part in what I call tactical signal intelligence from before the war. In those days, there weren't any well-organized arrangements for recruiting people for work of this kind. And there certainly weren't any security checks, positive vetting and all the rest of it that has come in. Selecting people and persuading them to come to Bletchley was done on a sort of personal basis. A lot of relatives turned up, daughters and sons, mostly daughters in fact. And this was assisted by the universities, particularly Cambridge. There was a very active senior Don at Cambridge. He was actually eventually head of St John's College, Cambridge, who helped the then director of Bletchley Park before the war, the organisation in London, Alistair Denison. They worked together in selecting people, and all the famous names that come down in the books written about the most important work at Bletchley were in fact recruited by a man named Martin Charlesworth.